I never thought a simple weekend getaway would turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Just me, my friends, and the woods. But as night fell, something watched us. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And no matter where we went, it followed. But the worst part, it knew things about us that we couldn't possibly have told anyone. And it wasn't just the woods, it was the house itself. Something in there wanted us. And it had been waiting for years. What we discovered inside that cabin would change everything. Stay tuned to find out what happened, if you dare. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. I've always considered myself an outdoorsy person. Growing up, my weekends were filled with hiking, camping, and exploring new places. So, when my two friends, Steve and Dave, invited me to spend a weekend camping in Green Hollow Woods, I didn't hesitate. The woods had an infamous reputation among locals. People talked about strange happenings, missing hikers, eerie whispers in the wind, and inexplicable lights in the trees at night. But I chalked it all up to superstition. I'd camped in more remote places before and never had any problems. We arrived at the site around dusk when the last rays of sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting long, distorted shadows on the forest floor. It was the kind of place you could easily lose track of time in, a secluded patch of forest miles from the nearest road. No cell service, no distractions, perfect for a weekend of escape. The campsite itself was nestled by a small stream where we set up our tents. After gathering firewood and preparing a small campfire, we settled in for the night. The evening started off like any other camping trip: laughter, campfire stories, and cold beers. But as the fire crackled, something felt wrong. There was an odd stillness in the air, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. By the time the stars were out, the usual chorus of nighttime creatures, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, had fallen eerily silent. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the silence began to gnaw at me. "What's with the quiet?" I asked, looking around. Steve and Dave just shrugged, seemingly unaffected. But I couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, watching us. I kept hearing faint rustling from the trees just out of sight, like someone, or something, was moving just beyond the firelight. It was unsettling. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. The woods were full of animals, and I probably just heard the wind or a deer moving through the underbrush. But the footsteps weren't random. They were deliberate, slow, steady, and too consistent to be an animal. I stood up, scanning the darkness with a growing sense of unease. The others didn't seem to notice. They were too busy enjoying the fire, laughing at something Steve had said. I cleared my throat, trying to brush off the anxiety gnawing at me, but I couldn't ignore it. I felt the eyes of something, or someone, watching us from the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. By the time we decided to turn in, the unsettling silence had deepened. I was having trouble shaking the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept hearing those faint, deliberate footsteps circling the camp. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the trees settling in the night, but deep down I knew something was off. It was around 2 a.m. when I finally couldn't take it anymore. I was lying in my tent, wide awake, my ears straining for any sound of movement. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't find my voice. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper. So faint, it could have been the wind, but it sounded too much like a voice. "Leave." I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to sit up, but my body felt paralyzed. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, my mind racing. Outside, there was nothing but darkness. "Who's there?" I called into the woods, my voice shaky. There was no response, no movement. Just an overwhelming silence that pressed in from all sides. I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam trembling in my hand. It illuminated nothing but the twisted shapes of branches and shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, a tall, dark shape, too still to be human. I blinked, and it was gone. I hurriedly zipped the tent back up and whispered to Steve and Dave, but they were both asleep, oblivious to what was happening. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I wasn't safe. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the whispers and footsteps. I was certain someone, or something, was out there. By the time the first light of morning crept through the trees, I felt a strange sense of relief. The woods were silent again, almost unnaturally so. We packed up quickly, not speaking much. Steve and Dave were both quiet too, sensing something was wrong but not fully understanding what. As we made our way back to the car, I glanced back at the forest. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just outside the tree line. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching. I hurried into the car, my heart racing. We drove away without saying a word. I haven't gone camping since that night. The figure, the whispers, and the unnatural silence still haunt me. I still wonder what we encountered in those woods, and I can't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us to leave. And I don't plan to ever find out what it wanted. I remember it clearly. It was a quiet Friday evening after a long week of work. I had just moved into a new apartment in the city, and I'd spent the past few days unpacking and getting settled. My name is Emma, and I'm the kind of person who enjoys solitude, especially after the chaos of the work week. That evening, I planned to spend some time reading and watching movies. It was supposed to be a peaceful night. I left my phone on the kitchen counter as I prepared dinner, figuring I'd check it once I was done eating. It wasn't a habit to leave it out of arm's reach, but that night, I did. I remember walking back into the kitchen after finishing my meal, expecting to grab my phone, but it was gone. I checked the counter. Nothing. I retraced my steps through the apartment, living room, bedroom, bathroom, but it was nowhere to be found. My anxiety spiked. I was sure I had left it right there on the counter. I called my phone from the landline, expecting to hear it vibrating or ringing from some corner of the apartment, but it went straight to voicemail. I checked the kitchen counter again. Nothing had changed. I even checked the refrigerator, thinking maybe I had absent-mindedly placed it there. But no, the phone was gone. I started to panic. I checked every drawer and corner of the apartment, even under the couch cushions. Nothing. As I stood there, growing increasingly frantic, I heard a faint, buzzing noise. It was coming from the kitchen. I rushed back in and found my phone sitting right on the counter where I had originally left it. But there was something odd about it now. It was lit up, showing several unread messages and missed calls from an unknown number. My heart sank. The messages seemed innocent at first. "Hey, it's been a while," or "We need to talk." But then I scrolled further down, and the messages took a disturbing turn. They were not from any number I recognized. In fact, they weren't from any human being at all. One message simply read, "We see you, Emma." I froze. My hands trembled as I scrolled through more messages. "Don't hide from us. We know where you are." The messages were chilling, filled with personal details that no one but me could possibly know. My work schedule, places I had visited that week, my routine. I had no idea who could possibly be behind this. I tried to call the police, but the call didn't go through. I dialed again and again, but the signal kept cutting off. My phone screen flickered, and before I knew it, the phone shut off completely. I tried turning it back on, but nothing happened. The screen stayed black. The entire situation felt wrong, unnaturally wrong. I was terrified. It was as if someone, or something, was watching me. I couldn't explain how the messages had appeared or why my phone had just shut off. I paced the apartment trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. The next morning I woke up to find my phone back to normal. It was as if the entire experience had been a strange, terrifying dream. There were no messages, no missed calls, no sign of the strange disturbance. The phone was completely fine. I had it checked by a technician, but they found no signs of hacking, malware, or any irregularities. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me that night. The messages still haunt me. I've changed my number, locked down all my social media, and taken extreme precautions with my privacy. But I still get this feeling that I'm being watched, that whoever was behind those messages is still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. When I first moved into my new apartment, it seemed like everything had finally fallen into place. I had been searching for months, and this place was a gem. The rent was surprisingly cheap for such a spacious, old building located just a short walk from the city centre. The apartment was small but charming, with creaky floorboards, high ceilings, and large windows that offered a beautiful view of the city. I was excited to start fresh in a new place. The building itself was older, at least it looked that way. It had a certain vintage character to it, with dark wooden paneling in the hallways and old-fashioned fixtures in the common areas. The kind of place that looked like it had a story to tell. I didn't mind the imperfections, I loved that about it. But there was one thing about the apartment that I never could shake: the strange door at the end of the hallway. It was an old wooden door with peeling white paint and a rusty, tarnished handle. The door didn't have a number, like the other apartments. It just sat there at the end of the hall, looking out of place. At first, I assumed it was a closet or a utility room. After all, buildings like this often have random doors leading to storage spaces or maintenance closets. But as the days went by, I started to feel uneasy about it. The more I looked at it, the more I felt something was wrong. I never mentioned it to anyone, not to my friends, not to the landlord, and not even to the neighbors who had lived there much longer than I had. No one ever talked about the door. It seemed to be ignored, like it didn't exist. But I couldn't shake the sense that it was watching me. The more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the more I found myself drawn to it. One night, curiosity got the best of me. I had just returned home from work, feeling unusually tense. The hallway was dark except for the dim light from the overhead bulbs. The door at the end of the hall stood there as always, silent and still. But tonight, something was different. I had to know what was behind it. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. When I reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, like it hadn't been touched in years. I hesitated for a moment, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the handle slowly and the door creaked open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It was dark, completely dark. No light came from the room, not even a sliver of moonlight. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and there was a strange smell in the room. like old dust mixed with something metallic. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out the outlines of the room. It was small, much smaller than it looked from the outside. There were no windows, no furniture, and no visible signs of what it had been used for, just 4 bare walls. But what really caught my attention were the scratches on the floor. The floor was covered with deep, irregular gouges. They weren't just marks. They looked like something had been dragged across the wood, over and over again. The grooves were uneven, as though something heavy and clumsy had been moved around. I couldn't imagine what could have caused them. There was no furniture in the room, nothing to explain the damage. My skin crawled as I realized that the room felt wrong, unnervingly wrong. I quickly backed out, slamming the door behind me. My pulse was racing and I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was running wild, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It didn't make sense. There was no way this room could exist. I had checked the floor plan when I first moved in, and it didn't show any extra rooms. In fact, the layout was simple, just a 1-bedroom apartment with a small living room and a bathroom. So where had this room come from? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment anymore. It was as if something had noticed me, noticed that I had found its secret room. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sounds. All I could hear was the occasional creak of the building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching me. I kept thinking about the room, about the scratches, and about the strange, oppressive air inside it. And I kept thinking about the fact that the door was still there, locked now, but who knew for how long? The next morning, I was too shaken to go to work. I felt like I had to get answers. So, I went to the landlord, trying to act casual, as if I hadn't just discovered an entire room I wasn't supposed to find. I asked him about the building, about the history, about anything that might explain why this door existed. He looked at me strangely, as if I had asked an inappropriate question. "What door?" he asked, his voice sharp. "There's no door at the end of your hallway." I felt my stomach drop. "Yes, there is," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's right at the end of the hall. Wooden, old, no number. I thought it was a closet." The landlord shook his head, almost amused. "There's nothing down there. Maybe you're seeing things. I'll have someone check it out for you." I returned to my apartment feeling uneasy. When I opened the door to my place, everything seemed normal. My bed was still unmade, the dishes from breakfast were still in the sink. But there was a strange tension in the air, like the apartment wasn't quite right. I went to the end of the hall to check the door. It was gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty wall. There was nothing. No door, no marks on the floor, just the same plain white wall that had always been there. I ran my fingers along the surface, searching for any hint that it had been there, but there was nothing. It was as though the door had never existed. Over the following days, I questioned myself. Had I imagined it? But how could I have imagined the deep scratches on the floor? How could I have imagined the unsettling darkness inside the room? I continued to live in the apartment for several more weeks, but I never saw that door again. I never spoke about it to anyone. Every now and then I would walk down that hall, expecting it to appear, but it never did. And with each passing day, the memory of it seemed to fade, until one night, months later, when I heard a soft creak from the hallway. I froze, staring at the dark hall from the doorway of my bedroom. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't need to check. I already knew. The door had returned. This time I didn't open it, but it was there again, waiting for me, just like before. It was a week before Halloween when I moved into my new house. My name is Alex, and I had spent the last several months searching for a place to call my own. After a few failed attempts at apartment hunting, I stumbled upon a house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it was affordable and had enough space for me to breathe after living in cramped apartments for so long. I figured it would be perfect. It had an eerie, old charm to it. Creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and an overgrown yard that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The moment I walked inside, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, as though the house had been waiting for me. The first night I spent there was uneventful. I unpacked, ordered some takeout, and sat down in the living room, taking in the quiet surroundings. The house was spacious, but there was something peculiar about the atmosphere. The air felt heavy, thick with a weight I couldn't quite place. The house creaked and groaned, like it was alive, shifting and settling in ways that made me uneasy. But I shrugged it off. It was an old house after all. I had always been drawn to older homes, and this one was no different. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the long day. The bedroom was at the far end of the house, with a large window that overlooked the yard. The view wasn't much, just a tangled mess of overgrown bushes and trees, but I loved how private it felt. It wasn't until I was lying in bed, about to fall asleep, that I heard the first sound that would change everything. A whisper. I couldn't tell where it came from. The sound was faint, like the wind blowing through the trees, but it was too distinct to ignore. I lay there, straining my ears, trying to identify it. The whisper seemed to say my name, just a soft, drawn-out Alex. It sent a chill down my spine. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the wind again. Or perhaps the old house had some strange acoustics that made every sound feel more pronounced. But it wasn't the wind. I quickly brushed off the unease and forced myself to sleep. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next morning, I woke up and went about my day as usual. I spent most of the day unpacking, settling into the house. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I began to feel watched, though there was no one around. My nerves were on edge, and the house felt different, like it was alive, breathing, waiting. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, determined not to let it get to me. But that night, the whispering returned. Alex. I woke up to the sound of my name again, but this time it was closer. My eyes snapped open and I sat up in bed, scanning the room. There was nothing. The moonlight barely filtered through the window, casting faint shadows along the walls. The house was eerily silent, but my heart raced. I was sure I had heard something. The whisper had been so clear this time, so close. It almost felt like someone was standing right next to my bed. I shook my head, trying to push the fear away. Maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something about the house wasn't right. The next few nights were a blur of restless sleep and strange occurrences. The whispers became more frequent, always calling my name in a way that seemed too deliberate to be the wind or an echo. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. I began to hear footsteps in the hallways, even though I was alone. Sometimes the floorboards creaked, as though someone was walking around the house when there was no one there, but whenever I checked, the house was empty. One evening, after several days of this disturbing pattern, I decided to confront it. I sat in the living room, waiting, listening. The house felt colder now, and the air was thick, with an almost oppressive silence. I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, just a flicker of shadow. But when I looked, there was nothing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense. And then the whisper came again. "Alex!" I froze. It was as if the voice was coming from within the walls, echoing around the room. It felt closer than ever before, as though it was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I stood up and began walking toward the staircase that led to the second floor. As I reached the foot of the stairs, the whisper grew louder. "Alex, come up here." I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet moved on their own. I ascended the staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon outside. I could feel the cold air surrounding me, and the whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere, surrounding me, urging me forward. "Alex, come to me." My breath caught in my throat. The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't just a whisper, but a voice, a deep, guttural tone that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I could feel the presence behind the door at the end of the hallway. I had never gone into that room. It had always been locked, and I never thought to ask why. But now, standing there, I couldn't ignore it. Something in me urged me to open the door. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The moment I touched it, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. My hand hesitated on the knob, but I slowly turned it. The door creaking open with a sound that made my skin crawl. The room was dark, colder than the rest of the house. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the far wall, was a large, framed photograph of me. It was an old photo, one I didn't recognize, and it was taken in the very room I was standing in. I stumbled backward, horrified. How was that possible? I didn't know anyone in this town. I had only moved here a week ago. There was no way anyone could have known me well enough to have taken a picture like that. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't calling my name. Instead, they were chanting it over and over again. "Alex, Alex, Alex." I slammed the door shut and ran downstairs, my heart racing in my chest. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and my phone, and I left the house without looking back. I spent the night at a friend's house, and when I returned the next morning, the house was still. Too still. Everything seemed normal again, except for the photograph. It was gone. The room was locked, and when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. I've since moved out of that house. I don't know who or what was trying to reach me, but I never went back. I still hear whispers sometimes, even in the safety of my new apartment, always calling my name. And I wonder deep down if the house still remembers me. It was the dead of winter when I moved into my new home. The house had been on the market for months, and it was clear why. The price was low, but it was in a quiet, remote town that didn't get much foot traffic. A small, two-story house with a lot of potential. My name is Sarah, and after several years of city living, I decided it was time to make a fresh start in the countryside. The air was cleaner, the people friendlier, and there was something about the isolation that appealed to me. The house itself wasn't anything special at first glance. It was an older structure built in the 1950s with a large front yard and a back porch that overlooked a wooded area. The real draw was its size. It had 4 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a huge kitchen. It felt perfect for someone looking to settle down. I was excited about the idea of fixing it up, bringing it back to its former glory. I could already picture myself making it cozy, painting the walls a warm color and filling it with memories. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was cold, the heating was spotty, and the wood floors creaked with every step I took, but I didn't mind. It was charming in its own way. I spent most of my time unpacking, cleaning, and sorting through the boxes. I was alone, and it felt peaceful. But something started to nag at me, an odd sensation that I couldn't quite place. It was a sound. At first I thought it was just the house settling. After all, old houses made strange noises. The wind would rattle the windows, the pipes would groan at odd hours, and the floors would creak under my feet. But one night, as I was in the kitchen making dinner, I heard it again, a voice. It was faint, barely audible, and it came from somewhere deep within the walls. It was a soft, rasping whisper, too low to make out words, but undeniably there. I froze, my knife suspended mid-air, my ears straining to catch the sound. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I told myself it was my imagination. After all, I had been alone for days, and the silence of the house could play tricks on anyone's mind. But the next night, the voice came back, and this time it was louder. I was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book, when I heard it again. Clearer now, a murmuring sound coming from behind the wall, just on the other side of the room. It sounded like a conversation, but the words were jumbled, incoherent. I got up and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice seemed to shift from one wall to the next, as if it were moving through the entire room, but I couldn't find the source. I wasn't crazy. I knew I wasn't imagining this. But there was no one else in the house. The voice wasn't human. It was something else. Something wrong. The next day, I tried to ignore it, but by the end of the week, the voice had become a constant presence. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was in the floorboards, in the ceiling, even in the vents. It wasn't always speaking, but it was always there. Sometimes it would be a faint murmur. Other times it would be louder, like a chant or a low growl. But it was never a clear voice, never a human voice. I tried everything to block it out. I kept the radio on, turned up the TV, and even played music through my phone, hoping that the noise would drown it out. But nothing worked. The voice persisted. One night, after weeks of this torment, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to investigate. I armed myself with a flashlight and went into the basement, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe it was old pipes or a rodent infestation. The air in the basement was damp, and the walls were covered in mold, but it seemed normal enough. But then I heard it. The voice again, louder than ever. It was coming from behind the wall in the basement. I froze, listening intently. It was no longer a murmur. It was a scream, a high-pitched wail of pain and desperation. The voice seemed to be begging, pleading for help. But I couldn't understand it. The words were distorted, echoing through the foundation of the house. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was behind that wall. I grabbed a hammer from my toolkit and began to chip away at the drywall. It was harder than I thought it would be, the wood and nails resisting my efforts. But I was determined. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through, exposing a small, dark space behind the wall. What I found inside made my blood run cold. There, in the darkness, was a small, narrow crawl space. It was barely large enough for a person to fit inside, but it looked like it had been untouched for years. The air was thick with dust and decay, and as I shone my flashlight into the space, I saw something that made me gasp. There was a small, rotting trunk wedged in the corner of the crawl space, its lid slightly ajar. And sitting next to it, no, pressed against it, was a figure, a human figure. It was an old, mummified body, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. The skin was yellowed and cracked, and the clothes were tattered, almost disintegrating. But what sent a wave of dread through me was the face. The face was turned toward me, its eyes wide open, staring directly at me with a lifeless, unblinking gaze. The lips were pulled back in a permanent grimace, as if frozen in an expression of terror. But the worst part was the voice. It was coming from the body. The whispers, the murmurs, the screams, they were all coming from this thing, trapped in the wall for who knows how long. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. The voice was getting louder, more frantic, as though it was reaching out to me, begging for release. I ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me, and never went back down there again. I moved out of that house the next day. I didn't tell anyone about what I found, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew no one would believe me. I still hear the voice sometimes, even now, even in the safety of my new apartment. It calls to me in my dreams, begging for release, whispering my name. I don't know who the person was that died in that wall, or why their spirit was trapped there, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't a coincidence that I moved into that house. The voice found me, and I don't think it's ever going to let me go. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when I moved into my new apartment. My name is Lily, and after a tough breakup and a job transfer, I was looking for a fresh start. The apartment was located in a charming, slightly run-down building in the heart of the city. It was the kind of place where the floors creaked under your feet, the windows rattled in the wind, and the air always smelled faintly of old wood and something a little musty. But it had character, and that's what I liked about it. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I spent the first night unpacking, setting up my things, and trying to get comfortable in the new space. The apartment had a cozy feel to it, with high ceilings and large windows that overlooked the city. There was an old, full-length mirror in the hallway that I barely paid attention to at first. It was ornate, with a gold frame that had seen better days. The glass was slightly cloudy, but it still looked like it belonged there, a relic from a bygone era. The first few days were uneventful. I went to work, came home, and settled into the routine of living alone. But that mirror, something about it started to bother me. It was like I couldn't escape it. Every time I passed by it, I felt a strange pull, like it was drawing my attention. At first, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, but it became impossible to ignore. One night, I was walking down the hallway to the bathroom when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The mirror, which had always reflected the empty hallway, now seemed different. It wasn't just a reflection of my face. There was something else there. A figure. It was a shadow standing behind me, but when I spun around, the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be a trick of the light, right? Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and over the next few days, the feeling only grew stronger. I'd be sitting in my living room, trying to relax, when I would feel an undeniable sensation that someone was watching me. The feeling wasn't confined to the hallway, though. It followed me everywhere in the apartment. It was like the mirror had some sort of presence, like it was alive, and it was aware of me, aware of everything I did. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I decided to confront the mirror. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection. The silence in the apartment felt thick, like something was about to happen. I ran my hand along the edge of the mirror's frame, feeling the dust that had accumulated there. It was strange how little I had noticed it before. I took a deep breath and said aloud, What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. The reflection in the mirror remained still, just my face staring back at me. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something. In the reflection, I could see my own expression. But behind me, there was a figure. It wasn't clear, like it was out of focus, but I could make out a face. The face was pale, gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The figure didn't move, but I could sense its presence as if it were waiting for me to do something, anything. I turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. My breathing quickened, and I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't imagining this. Something in that mirror was alive, and it was aware of me. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I started to avoid the hallway, not wanting to even look at the mirror, but I couldn't avoid it forever. I tried to ignore the feeling that something was following me, that it was always just behind me, lurking. Every time I walked past the mirror, I felt it watching me. And the figure, it started to appear more and more. Each time I looked, the figure grew clearer. It was no longer a shadowy outline, but a distinct person. A man, tall and thin, with dark, hollow eyes and a mouth that was slightly open, as if he were about to speak. But he never did. He just stared, and the more I saw him, the more I realized that he was familiar. I had never seen this man before in my life, but there was something about him that felt so familiar, as if he were someone I should know. And that's when it hit me. The man in the mirror was me. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. The figure in the mirror was a distorted version of myself. His skin was pale, his face gaunt, his hair dark and unkempt. But it was me, or rather, it was some twisted version of me, someone who shouldn't exist. It felt like I was staring at a reflection of what I could become if I let myself go. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if something more sinister was at play. But I had to know more. I did some research about the building, hoping to find answers. It was an old place built in the early 1900s, but there was very little information about its history. No one seemed to know much about it. But I did find one unsettling detail. The previous tenant, a woman named Margaret, had died in the apartment under mysterious circumstances. Her cause of death was never determined, but there were rumors that she had been obsessed with the mirror. Neighbors reported that she would spend hours staring into it, speaking to her reflection as though it was someone else. The more I dug, the more I learned about Margaret. She had been a quiet, reclusive woman, but she had a history of mental illness. Some believed she had gone mad from staring at the mirror, driven insane by the face she saw staring back at her. But what struck me the most was one final detail in the records. Before she died, Margaret had been hearing voices. Voices from the mirror. I don't know if it's the mirror itself that's cursed, or if it's something else, something darker, that's tied to this apartment. But I know one thing for sure. I'm not the first person to be haunted by whatever lives within that mirror. The man, or whatever it is, still watches me. Every time I look into the mirror, he's there. His hollow eyes staring back at me. Sometimes, I wonder if I'm already losing myself, if the reflection I see is slowly taking over. Sometimes it feels like it's calling me, urging me to step closer, to become him. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I've tried everything, covering the mirror with a cloth, even leaving the apartment for days at a time. But it's always there when I return, watching, waiting, and now, every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm no longer alone. That figure, that twisted version of me, it's always with me. In my dreams, in my thoughts, it's there waiting to take over. I just hope that one day I'll be able to escape its grasp. But deep down, I'm starting to wonder, am I already too far gone? It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a small escape from the chaotic noise of city life. My name is Mia, and at the time, I was living in a cramped apartment in the heart of the city. My friends and I decided to rent a house for the weekend in a quiet, rural area, a place far removed from the noise, the traffic, and the pressure of our daily routines. We had found the perfect spot, an old house, nestled on a plot of land, surrounded by trees. It was secluded, peaceful, and quiet, exactly what we needed. We arrived at the house late in the evening, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows on the dirt road that led to the front door. The house was beautiful. Though a little worn down, it had a certain charm, with its large windows, old wooden beams, and a wraparound porch that made it feel like something out of an old movie. It was the perfect escape from the city, and we were all excited to settle in. The first few hours were exactly what we wanted. Relaxing. We opened some wine, played board games, and took turns reminiscing about college days. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. The house, while beautiful, had a strange atmosphere. The air was thick, like the house itself had a history, one that it wasn't sharing. Every room seemed to have a slightly different feel to it. The living room was cozy, warm, and inviting. The kitchen had a homey smell like freshly baked bread, but the upstairs hallway, it was cold, and the door at the end of the hallway was the strangest thing. I didn't notice it at first, but it was hard to ignore once I did. The hallway upstairs was narrow, the walls lined with old peeling wallpaper. At the end of the hall was a door, an old wooden door painted black. It looked out of place. The rest of the house had whitewashed or natural wood doors, but this one was different. The black door seemed to absorb the light, making the hallway feel even darker. At first I chalked it up to just a weird design choice, but the more I looked at it, the more it unnerved me. That night, after a few glasses of wine, I went upstairs to grab a sweater from my bag. As I passed the black door, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the cold air that seemed to come from the door, it was something else, something alive. I stopped, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It was as if the door was waiting for me to open it. But I didn't. I pulled my hand away and quickly went to my room. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went downstairs and asked the others if they had noticed anything strange about the door at the end of the hall. They all laughed, saying I was being paranoid. "It's just a door," one of them, Katie, said. "It's probably just been there for years. Old houses have weird stuff like that." But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, we sat around the fire in the living room, laughing and joking, when I noticed something strange. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you uneasy. There were no sounds of birds outside, no rustling of the wind in the trees. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation grew stronger. I made my way upstairs again, deciding to check the door. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked straight toward it, feeling that inexplicable pull. My hand gripped the cold brass handle, and I turned it slowly. The door creaked open. What I saw inside was nothing like I expected. The room beyond the door was small, dark, and filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. There was a large, four-poster bed in the center of the room, its frame intricately carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. But it wasn't the room itself that startled me. It was what I found on the walls. The walls were covered in strange red markings, symbols that seemed to shift and move as I looked at them, like they were alive. Some of the symbols were simple, like circles and lines, but others were more complex, intricate designs that made my stomach turn just looking at them. There was an oppressive air about the room, like it was somehow trapped in time. I quickly backed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. What was that place, and why had I never noticed it before? When I went back downstairs to tell the others, they all just looked at me like I was crazy. I tried to explain what I saw, but they didn't seem concerned. Katie, who had always been the skeptical one, laughed it off. "It's just an old room, Mia. It's probably nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, the house felt suffocating. I couldn't sleep no matter how hard I tried. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard something, faint scratching coming from upstairs. It was soft at first, like nails dragging across wood, but it grew louder, more persistent. I got up and walked to the door, unsure of what I was about to do. But before I could take a step, the sound stopped. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft and distant. "Mia?" I froze. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if I had just imagined it. But then I heard it again, louder this time, echoing through the house. "Mia, come back to the door." My heart stopped. That was it. I couldn't stay here any longer. I woke the others and told them we had to leave. But when we went upstairs to pack our things, we found the black door wide open. The room inside was empty now, the sheets on the furniture torn to shreds, and the strange symbols on the walls. They were gone. The room was just a regular, dusty storage room. We left the house that night, packed our bags, and drove back to the city. We didn't speak much during the drive, and I couldn't get the feeling of those strange eyes on me out of my mind. I never went back to that house, and I never planned to. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about that black door and the voice I heard calling my name. I don't know what happened that night, or why the house seemed to change, but I've never been able to forget the feeling of something waiting behind that door, something ancient and dark. And sometimes when I lie awake at night, I still hear that voice in my head, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "Mia, come back." Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode